We're here to discuss the MUTCD, which is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And we're going to talk about how it influences our streets being operated and managed. Angie Schmitt is with us today. She's one of the country's best known writers and experts on the topic of sustainable transportation. And she was a longtime national editor at Streetsblog. She was also our keynote speaker at last fall's transportation conference. And she has recently published her book, Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. It's an excellent read. Joining her today is Don Kostelec, who's principal at Vitruvian Planning and a 17-year professional in active transportation and comprehensive planning. And Don has been participating on a national organizing group consisting of America Walks, the League of American Bicyclists, and the Vision Zero Network to define common themes and concerns within the MUTCD since it's up for public comment. I think, Angie, you might have been involved in that group as well, but I'm not sure. Okay, you have, great. So I'm going to turn it over to Angie and she's going to go ahead and get started. And welcome to both of you. We're glad that you're here.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. I do have a little presentation to share, but it's not too formal. So those of us who have worked in this field and trying to promote safer walking and biking, we all get to know about the MUTCD and we all sort of hate it. It's a big obstacle to doing the kind of things I think most people on this call would like to see happen with, more crosswalks, safer crossings, better bike facilities, and that type of thing. So just as an overview, real quickly, before I get started with these slides I have here. So the MUTCD is an engineering manual. It's used by engineers all over the country and it dictates signs and markings. So it dictates things like where crosswalks go, what traffic signals look like, what street signs look like, what pavement markings look like, how reflective they are, how wide they are. And the original idea for it, and it dates back to this sort of the highway era in the United States, was to have some uniformity in the look of our signs and signals around the country, which I think we can all sort of see intuitively the benefit of. But in practice, there's some sort of bad concepts baked into this document. Like I said, it goes back to the highway era, and it was written by traffic engineers, and it presents a lot of standards as being sort of rational and scientific that are really more sort of based in value judgments about what streets are for, who it's important to serve. And, one of the key themes throughout all of it is, what we see sort of in the traditional traffic engineering profession sort of overall. And it's this almost total emphasis on moving vehicles quickly, often at the expense of safety, especially for vulnerable road users, pedestrians, cyclists, wheelchair users, etc. So as people already mentioned, I'm working with a group. I'm actually here representing America Walks. And we're working with NACTO, the Bike League, pretty much everyone, Transportation for America, pretty much everyone who's working in this space from sort of a pro-bike, pro-walk perspective has sort of thrown their hat in the ring, thinks this is very important. So I'm gonna explain a little bit more with these slides, which again were produced by, these were actually produced by NACTO, and they shared them with me. If you want to screenshot these and share these on your own devices, that's welcome as well, because we're just trying to give people visually a real sense sort of for what's at stake here. And finally, before I move on, one thing I wanted to say, the MUTCD is an engineering manual. So it's sort of the recipe book, we say, for streets in the United States, but it's actually also the law. This is a federal regulation. It's going through the Federal Highway Administration right now. And the version that was presented, is the first update in 10 years, is really disappointing to a lot of people who work in this space. This was produced under the previous administration. So now groups like NACTO, groups like America Walks, the Bike League, are asking this new administration to sort of start fresh, almost, to take some time, go back through this, and make some pretty big changes. And the exciting thing about this is, and I'm really excited to be working on this, because we have an opportunity to um, contribute to a change that would affect almost every street and neighborhood and community in the United States if we could get some reforms in this. So hopefully some of these images that I share will give you a sense for sort of how arbitrary some of these rules are and sort of how harmful they can be, especially in some of our more urban neighborhoods or small towns, where the focus again shouldn't be speeding cars as quickly as possible, but creating safe and welcoming places. So, okay, I'm just gonna run through some of this and then I'll turn it over to Don. But so the new manual, the new update says brick crosswalks, this thing here on the left, that is allowed, but rainbow crosswalks, any painted crosswalks, not allowed. And that's just there's really no formal research supporting any safety problem with rainbow crosswalks. I think people sort of intuitively understand what they are, and a lot of people also like them, think they can contribute to more of a community feel. A lot of people in some places around the country have dedicated volunteer hours to making those happen, and the MUTCD would just forbid them, this new edition. Okay, here's another example of so how arbitrary it is. Some of this stuff is. So the new MUT says a bump out like this, which we all love, slows traffic, reduces pedestrian crossing times, that would be allowed. But right here we basically have one, and it has a bike lane going through it. So we have an island right here. That would not be allowed in the new MUTCD. Okay. So here's another weird double standard. An easy pass, so a special lane on a highway for people who, whatever the rules are in your state, you guys understand what I mean by that. The new MUTCD makes it really easy to do that. But if you want to do a red bike lane in your city, you still have to undergo all these different rounds of red tape, testing, that type of thing. So there's green light for this, for red painted bus lanes, all this additional work that has to be done before that's allowed. Okay, so they're allowing all this sort of things on the left here. You're warning people about different animals. For some reason, this sign here on the right, they're not allowing. Trail signals, for whatever reason, I'm not 100% sure, and maybe Don could speak to how they're justifying that. They would not allow that. You're not able to control traffic at a trail that way, according to the MUTCD. So another thing, sort of hard to explain, they have decided that green painted bike lanes should not be allowed, even though those are in use in a lot of cities and they help visually demarcate the places bikes are supposed to be and cars are not. For some reason are not allowed in the new MUTCD. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here, but this is a really important point and something I point out in my book, and I think really speaks to the problems with this document and how it creates problems. So one thing the MUTC does is it says where crosswalks can be installed with a traffic signal. And when it comes to pedestrian safety, that's a really important part of pedestrian infrastructure. To get across the street, that's one of the safest ways to get cars to yield, right? But we know that installing a traffic signal in a crosswalk can delay drivers. So the MUTC, like I said, is embedded with all these sort of value judgments that emphasize vehicle movement over safety. So the MUTCD says that you cannot install a crosswalk with a traffic signal unless almost 100 pedestrians are crossing at the location every hour, which this is, again, a location that there is not a safe crossing at right now. So you need enormous pedestrian volume to justify delaying drivers with a traffic signal. Failing that, the MUTCD says if 3 or 4 pedestrians are injured at this location in a single year, then in that case, a signal and a crosswalk is warranted. So 3 people have to injure themselves at a single location in a year. That is not, we should be approaching safety much more proactively. And safety should be the default, not sort of something we accommodate after the fact. So as you can see, there's a real double standard when it comes to the way we're treating drivers. Over here, you can add vehicle signals pretty much wherever, but the standards for pedestrians are very high and arbitrary. So that's the kind of thing we'd like to see change. And I know all this is a little bit depressing, but we really need your help. This is an opportunity where people can get involved. This is not a done deal right now. This is up through the federal regulatory process, has been posted at the Federal Registrar, and they're requesting comments right now. So me, sort of at America Walks, we're encouraging folks like you to go to that website, and you can use either of these websites I posted here, the top one from NACDO, or the bottom one here from America Walks. We have an action alert about it, where you guys can, we have a form letter, or you can add your own comments, and those will be seen by the people whose job it is to advance these regulations, and they're supposed to be formally considered. And we think with this new administration and with the pressure we're trying to build in this campaign, there's a real opportunity for reform here, and for the kind of widespread lasting reform that could have a big impact across the country. Okay, so with that, I'm just gonna turn it over to Don.
Thanks, Angie. I'm going to go through a couple of things here and really try to give you an idea maybe of how the sausage is made with this, why it matters, and why we can kind of get lost maybe in some of this alphabet soup. And if in a couple of locations I end up talking in circles, it's because the MUTCD itself talks in circles. A little bit about what is it, and I'll start with that. The first edition was derived in 1935 to, quote, establish the need for a manual that standardized the use and design of traffic control devices, or TCDs. And the reason it's important to understand what a traffic control device is and what MUTCD attempts to regulate is to differentiate it from other kind of physical infrastructure elements on our streets. So a speed limit sign, a traffic signal, a lane striping, a crosswalk, those are the types of things that are a traffic control device in MUTCD. A protected bike lane, for example, is not a traffic control device, and that's coming straight from Federal Highway Administration. And the other side of this that I'll touch on in a second is things like design manuals and things that guide stuff like lane widths, the design of a curb, the width of a sidewalk. Those things are not the type of things you're going to find in MUTCD. MUTCD is why a speed limit sign in Florida looks the same as it is in Idaho. MUTCD is why our center line stripes are yellow and white on the outside, and if you go to Europe, they're the opposite. That version was not completely rewritten until 36 years later in 1971, and did not include anything on bicycling facilities until 1978. And only in 2009, after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1991, did MUTCD properly reflect ADA requirements for things like pedestrian access in construction zones, which despite 12 years after some very stringent language, I still see horrific and unsafe application of it across the country. So that's kind of where we've came from. I think an important point is it's not been completely rewritten in 50 years. And I kind of call it the Winchester Mystery House of traffic engineering. It is really this mishmash of a lot of things thrown on top of each other. So why do we care in 2021? Well, we're undergoing the first update since 2009. And most of this was predicated on autonomous vehicles. And there's a brand new chapter on autonomous vehicles that is very funky. It appears to mostly have been written by the autonomous vehicle industry. It doesn't provide a lot of clear information on autonomous vehicles. For bicyclists, it kind of admits the failure of autonomous vehicles to properly pick up and understand bicyclists, because it talks about protected bike lanes almost being a necessity because of the inabilities of autonomous vehicles. So there's one kind of feather in the cap for active transportation safety. But if you read that chapter in the draft, it's really, really weird, and where it can matter perhaps for small cities. And we heard this in the Idaho Autonomous Vehicle Task Force. What if we have to put local centerline striping on all of our local residential streets? That's not a common practice that we do. We generally only do those on higher speed or higher volume collector and arterials. And there's some language in here about that. So when we talk about cost to local government, there's some implications that have that are there. Unfortunately, in this edition, little has been done to really up the game for the safety of people who walk and bike. And I think that's been the main consternation of the national organizations on this. I mean, after all, if the autonomous vehicle industry can write their own chapters, why can't the League of American Bicyclists? Why can't America Walks? So you have an opportunity. It's out for public comment. It's out for public comment until May 14th. That deadline was extended. And it's the most widely available version that's ever been out for public review, especially due to things like social media and advocacy organizations. So back to this kind of confusion between these different organizations, MUTCD is a Federal Highway Administration document endorsed by the federal government. In Idaho, it is also endorsed under the administrative rules in our state code from the Idaho Transportation Department. AASHTO is essentially the national organization of state DOTs. Agencies like ITD sit on their board of directors and many of their technical committees, and they issue a different design manual, colloquially called the Green Book, that has several things of guidance in it. And I'll explain the difference of guidance and standard in a second. And then there's the Institute for Transportation Engineers, which is a different organization that has traditionally focused a little more on the traffic engineering side of civil engineering versus kind of the structural side of it, where AASHTO covers all those things. And ITE has been kind of at the forefront of all these organizations when it comes to things like Vision Zero that you've talked about in a couple of these. So MUTCD, this is one of the diagrams from it. It helps regulate how things like a pedestrian crossing signal are timed. A walk interval, when you get the walk signal, is 7 seconds minimum. There's some deviations from that you could justify. The countdown or pedestrian change interval is a function of the width of the road divided by 3.5 feet per second, which is a common walk speed calculation. So for example, if the street is 35 feet wide and that's the crossing, you get a countdown of 10 seconds. If it's 70 feet wide, you would get a countdown of 20 seconds. So these are the things when you get up to an intersection, push a button, that MUTCD helps highway agencies and traffic engineers do various things within this particular environment. The funny part, this was an email sent to me, there's a National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is loosely organized but not a part of FHWA, to make recommendations on MUTCD. And they usually meet annually at the Transportation Research Board. And what we all found interesting about this was an email sent by a member of their Traffic Signals Committee, essentially calling the efforts by the national walking and bicycling organizations to really revamp MUTCD as cancel culture. And this went out to a couple different people. They're asking FHWA to reframe, rewrite, and rescind the current NPA, which is Notice of Proposed Amendment, which is the federal process, due to it being, as Angie said, too autocentric, too focused on traffic controls, and unconcerned with a lot of proven safety measures. So there's a lot of kind of traditional entities out there that are uncomfortable of other people kind of starting to look in this sandbox and reveal it for some of its shortcomings. This is the letter that email was referring to that came from AASHTO, ITE, and NCUTCD. and their directors encouraging FHWA to stay the course and expedite issuance of this. The ironic piece I find here is it says it has the potential to save numerous lives and prevent serious injuries on the nation's transportation system. The United States has the highest traffic fatality rate of any wealthy nation. So the cynic in me would say, I don't know that MUTCD really does that job altogether. And here's an example. This is NHTSA's pedestrian fatalities in our country. And MUTCD, since it was last updated, this is what has happened in the increase in pedestrian fatalities. And like I said, you will see very little changes in MUTCD to address this pedestrian safety need. So on one hand, they're saying it will promote safety, but there's nothing in it to deal with a death rate that has risen 50% since it has last been done. And I'll show you some of those reasons. So one of the things America Walks had asked for was kind of issues and stories, and this is what I would encourage you to write to them, is some of the things we've encountered in trying to get safer facilities. And one of the ones they allowed me to highlight was out here on Chinden and 38th in Garden City, and a project that we worked on a few years ago. So I'm going to play the video that I did for them for this to kind of show you how this document and the strict adherence to it, and I'll get into that subtlety in a second, can help inhibit safety, and in this case, prohibit access to food for people.
Hey, Don, we can't see it. We can't see the video.
Thank you. Let me.
I think you have to take off your screen sharing.
Let's see. Now can you see it?
Yes, yes. Can you start it over? I'm having trouble hearing it now.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to hear. Don, do you think you could reshare it with the, there's a little feature when you go to share your screen, it says at the bottom, something like share, optimize for video or something like that. Share your sound.
Tell me if this is better.
We were doing a Garden City livable streets plan 7 years ago, and we observed many people crossing at this location to get to this convenience store. And you might say, well, it's just a convenience store. Well, it's the only food outlet within several miles of here. And if you go into that convenience store, you can see that they know that. They stock things on those shelves that you don't see in a normal convenience store. When we look at the traffic engineering of this, it's a 5-lane, typical hideous American road. If I do what the engineers want me to do to cross here, I would walk down to that signal at Orchard and cross. I have to cross a high-speed slip lane to do so. I have to wait for a very long signal cycle and walk back to here. That's a 12-minute trip one way. The nearest signal with a pedestrian crossing is nearly 2,400 feet to the west. That signal in the foreground is a signal for a fire station and has no pedestrian signal or crosswalk. So after we observed this, we asked the Idaho Transportation Department and the Ada County Highway District to do that magical MUTCD signal warrant analysis. And what that says for something like a pedestrian hybrid beacon or what's called a hawk signal is we need 20 pedestrians in an hour willing to risk their lives to cross Chinden in order to justify that. That's how the MUTCD compromises safety. So we asked them to do it. They did it. And they found that they had 18 pedestrians in the peak hour willing to risk their lives to get food. Ironically, there were also 4 motorists from this neighborhood that crossed Chinden went to the convenience store, and crossed back. Would MUTCD allow us to count those as likely pedestrian trips if we had a safe crossing here? Oh, of course not. So when we think about things like that, signal warrants, and value of time, we often hear that, hey, we gotta count for motorist level of service. We can't delay them. You see the person crossing up there. But they want us to walk 12 minutes out of our way just to cross the street. A 24-minute round trip just to get food. Beyond the food issue, down at the end of this block by maybe a third of a mile is the Boise River Greenbelt, another access point and an active transportation corridor for our region. Would we make motorists drive 12 minutes out of their way just to cross a street? No, we'd never do that. But because of the strict adherence to MUTCD, we're denying some of the most economically challenged areas of the Boise region safe access to food, to recreation. That's how MUTCD is killing the people of this country.
And so that was 7 years ago. And to this day, there's still no signal at that location.
Let's see how our low.
It's one of my other cynical videos. Let's see. Let's share that back. Where'd it go? All right. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Looks good.
So here's that table for that hawk signal that's in there. And this is kind of what you'll see in kind of the technical nuances of that. A pedestrian hybrid beacon or a hawk signal, if you don't know, is the type that has the 3 lights at the top. It starts with a yellow flasher to warn motorists to stop. The lights then go to red solid, and that's when the pedestrian gets the walk signal. And when they go to flashing red, that's when motorists may proceed if the crosswalk in front of them is clear after coming to a complete stop. That's when you would have the countdown signal. We probably have more of these, to ACHD's credit, in Ada County per capita than most cities in the country. And I think they've done a pretty good job of putting them in and actually planning and designing them with projects to kind of break up these 1 mile segments. And to their credit, they do not always stringently adhere to this magical 20 pedestrians in an hour that are there. They have considered other things. And I would say, in my experience in working across the country, that's pretty atypical, but reflects what could be a more flexible approach that we could have in looking at MUTCD to account for some other factors. So I'm going to cover some myths related to MUTCD that may help you in your comments. One, we'll often hear, well, MUTCD is a standard, and that's not totally true. MUTCD does contain standards, but not all of MUTCD and every passage in it is something that has to require strict adherence. If you go into the bowels of the document, you will find these things A, B, C, and D labeled in different ways. A standard will always be in this bold black text, and the word shall will be used. These are the types of things, if you're working with your local engineer and others, that you should not expect them to be incredibly flexible upon because of the use of the word shall. A guidance statement is something that says should, and really should look at conditions that maybe would justify not doing it and making those judgments there. And then there's other things called options and support, and the verb may is typically used as options, and support will show some other features for that. So here's an example. Even beyond the word standard, the courts and the Federal Highway Administration recognize that this manual, all 800 pages of it, cannot account for every situation in the country. And so it describes the application location of traffic control devices, but shall is not a legal requirement for their installation. It means if you put it in, you need to follow it, but it also recognizes there is still a lot of room for engineering judgment to occur. And the courts have generally agreed that an engineer and his or her license is actually more important than what a design manual says. So we do have some opportunities to be more flexible, but it's kind of your adventure may vary, and a lot of it is related to agency and individual culture, going back to seeing times where I think ACHD has been more flexible on this. For example, they recently approved a rapid flash beacon pedestrian control at a place where they felt there was just a lot of distance between the other crossings and felt it would be appropriate to do so. They didn't have to apply to some of the more rigid examples. Here's an example within MUTCD where you can see something like a standard, the bold text with the word shall, and the other lighter text under it. So in calling MUTCD as a whole a standard is simply not true. It does contain some standards, but not everything in it is considered a standard. Here's that option with the word may and guidance with the word should that's included there. I've always been intrigued by this study that happened in 2014, and they looked at the effects of tort liability, which is, an agency getting sued related to their adherence to MUTCD. And so if you ever hear, well, MUTCD won't allow it, or we've got to follow MUTCD, when state DOTs get sued, they all of a sudden say, well, we're not obligated to follow it. MUTCD signage designs do not require direct adherence. Instead, MUTCD defers to engineering judgment and studies when making sign placement decisions. And they argue that because they exercise regional engineering judgment, their decisions are discretionary and therefore immune from liability. And they argue that MUTCD provisions are not mandatory. And one DOT stated that MUTCD is not a legal requirement to install any sign, that a diagram or picture is not a requirement, and that the manual doesn't obligate the department to create a traffic control plan or include more than one warning sign in a given area. This one has a case in it from Idaho, where a pedestrian was hit crossing an ITD road in Nampa and did attempt to sue the agency, saying that engineering study had not been done and that the agency was potentially negligent in doing so. What I find interesting is this last far right, the state's high accident location monitoring program fulfilled any duty that the state had to the victim in the crash to improve and maintain its highways, and looking at a crosswalk. And that's where we kind of get frustrated. We know from studies that the lack of pedestrian crashes isn't a sign of safety, because we know road design can inhibit or suppress pedestrian and bicyclist activity. So a lot of times we'll hear, well, there's no crashes there, so it's fine. No, that doesn't mean it's safe. It means the activity may not be occurring because there is a lack of safety or lack of a sense of safety, but there is research on the adherence to those standards. Another myth, and Angie kind of touched on this, is that it's based strictly on science. The 85th percentile rule, and I won't go into the nuance of that, has been used for a long time to set speed limits on all types of roadways. And in 2017, the National Transportation Safety Board basically said there's really not a lot of science to show that that is the case, especially when it comes to urban streets. The original 85th percentile studies were based on rural highways, and they said that that may be dated research and not valid under scrutiny. And a big piece of that they mention is the 85th percentile rule does not consider pedestrians or bicyclists for their safety needs. And I'll show you some examples of that. So in MUTCD, they have modified their language in the draft MUTCD somewhat to account for that. And what you're seeing here is a direct screen capture from the redlined or tracked change version of the draft MUTCD. And I like looking at that one because I'm familiar enough with the old version to see what the changes would be. You'll note here that they have called out specifically 85th percentile on freeways or expressways, kind of differentiating them from that. Road context and pedestrian activity, bicycle activity is noted above. And then at the bottom, there are other adopted measures from the Federal Highway Administration to set speed limits, such as US limits to and a safe systems that do account for those things. So the good part is they have responded in this particular case to some of those things. I think among some of the engineers I know that are on the committee for MUTCD, they feel that this didn't quite go far enough. And we've definitely seen, even with the 85th percentile applied on Idaho's interstates, that our crashes and fatalities have gone up as they have on freeways nationwide. So I suspect there to be more debate on that. But if you're going to support something in your letter, hey, they've at least backed off of it somewhat, acknowledged better need of pedestrians and bicyclists, and that there are other acceptable ways to set speed limits outside the 85th percentile rule for some of those urban streets. Give you an example here in the Boise area of how using the 85th percentile to set a speed limit really doesn't account for other factors of road design. And this was on 10 Mile out in Meridian. And you'll note that it was originally set at 35. It was later increased to 40 before finally getting bumped to its current locate 45-mile-an-hour limit. So I'm going to show you these symbols, these pictures. Most of them are from 10 Mile. The other is from USTIC because I couldn't find a similar 35-mile-an-hour section on 10 Mile. Even they're saying here, the exact same of the design of the road has had 3 different speed limits, and that road hasn't been in place for 10 years. So here's the one that we're talking about. It's a 5-lane road. It's got your typical unprotected bike lane there that we now know are not really the safest type of application for this. But see the speed limit sign of 45 miles an hour. Well, just north of that intersection is the exact same road design, the exact same bike lane and sidewalk design, but a 40-mile-an-hour limit. So you, the pedestrian or bicyclist, are somehow supposed to feel safer here because of the sign. That's kind of what this is saying. This is USTIC. Again, kind of the exact same design of road, but a 35-mile-an-hour expectation. So we've got 3 different speed expectations without the design of the road changing. And that's where this frustration with the 85th percentile is coming into play. And then in our school zones, obviously a little less can be done because it's time of day, but here's another speed expectation, again on 10 Mile, in a section that has a very similar design. And so that's why the advocacy organizations or others are looking to get things like that changed. This one always got me. A couple years ago, the NCUTCD wanted to consider a requirement for pedestrian signal heads to be installed when traffic signals are there. And one of the arguments was, well, that would cost too much. Well, one of the funny things about MUTCD is it requires 2 traffic signal heads, even if there's only 1 lane, but cost isn't really a consideration there. So in the end, NCUTCD decided against changing it. The vote got a majority, but it needed a two-third majority to pass. And here's Bill Schulteis, who's with Tool Design, and Dong-Ho Chang, a traffic engineer in Seattle, who have championed this, being disappointed. And where I say that, is this based on science? No, it's based on a raise of hands of whether this would go forward. And when we talk about equity and other issues, you can look at the makeup of the room and maybe ask yourself, are these the kind of folks that represent the needs of pedestrians and bicyclists in kind of making this? Yet we're supposed to understand that this decision was somehow based on science. And this last one, before I talk about commenting, is it's based on safety. So this gets at that issue of traffic signal warrants and things that Angie was talking about. And this is kind of the stricter adherence to get a full signal that's in there. And a lot of this is based on motorist delay and what's there. So during an average day, 100 or more for each of the 4 hours, or 190 or more during any 1 hour to justify that type of signal. We've not really gone back and turned the screws on these kind of thresholds to see how valid that they are. And I think that's what America Walks and others are asking. Going back to that hawk signal example I gave, a good thing with it is it allows us to look at a lower threshold, getting down to 20 an hour, to put in this type of signal. Well, why is that? These signals delay motorists less because they can go as soon as the light starts flashing and the crosswalk is clear. So one of the things that has occurred in this MUTCD is things like rectangular rapid flash beacons, which have some really good safety science behind them, have now become something that cities and agencies don't have to ask for special permission to do. They have been applied for almost a decade, but a city or an agency simply writes a form letter and FHWA approves it. They no longer have to do that. But I would say a lot of people have still been doing this, and these are some examples from Boise. The problem is MUTCD doesn't prohibit this. And this is a US highway down in Preston, Idaho, where all we've done is slap the rapid flash beacons on the side. We've done a low visibility, the least effective crosswalk, and we've really put these signs outside the field of vision for the driver. And I wish MUTCD would take the step to go, no, you can't do this alone in this situation. Versus an example we have here in Boise on Apple from ACHD, where they have put a Z crossing median in a 5-lane road. In this situation, you could do some curb extensions. You could look at the possibility of a median island if there wasn't conflicting turning movements for traffic. You could look at putting mast arms over there with the rapid flashers. But if I can get a full perspective panorama of the mountains in the picture, it's not the right application of a rapid flash beacon, but you're not going to find anything in MUTCD telling you not to do this. Similarly, this is in Mountain Home, a typical 5-lane arterial, again, with nothing but rapid flash beacons slapped on the side. And this is a school zone. So let's imagine telling your 5-year-old, you should be safe crossing here because of a flashing yellow light that sits on the side. MUTCD doesn't prohibit this application. It doesn't prescribe the higher measures that are needed. Going back to the hawk example, again, it's now formalized. You don't have to ask for special permission. We've got some really good examples in our state of them, and they show some good compliance. And here's one in a school zone with kind of a typical Idaho safe routes to school example of an advanced school zone warning and the hawk signal applied. If you look at the street context here, this is a pretty good application. We've got some street friction with on-street parking. We've got some trees. We've got some things that narrow the focus. Here's an example in Blackfoot, going over to the Potato Museum and a crossing that is done in their downtown with an advance warning and for a school zone. And you see the more elaborate structures overhead that I think is a pretty good application in this particular environment. There could be some small features to be added, but you see things even like the curb extensions there. What MUTCD doesn't prohibit was a project we recently had on Cloverdale in Boise, where a full traffic signal was installed for this school zone on Cloverdale. When the roadway was widened, they made it a hawk signal, and the result has now led to crossing guards quitting their jobs and kids being safety bused from across the street that had been there previously. The speed limit was raised on this section of road, and this hawk signal doesn't provide the same protection as a full signal. Yet MUTCD in its draft form doesn't give the right stipulations that can prohibit agencies from doing this. And the end result is crossing guards are quitting their jobs and we're busing kids from across the street. So what can you do? And Cynthia's going to send these links to you. The national organizations, America Walks, the League of American Bicyclists, NACTO, have different things on their sites. If you just Google those organizations with MUTCD, you're going to find this. America Walks has some text in a form letter to send. I'm not the biggest one on form letters. I like what the League of American Bicyclists is doing, is asking to tell a story about your town or an issue where you might have run into these things and why we need to take a fresh look at this. If you were to ask me of, hey, Don, should we stop it and completely rewrite it? I don't know that I would go that far. What I would want FHWA to do is commit to an immediate revision as soon as this one goes through that's going to look at factors that need to be incorporated to make our streets safer for walking and biking. I don't know that they're going to scrap it altogether. There's a lot of other lobbying efforts behind it that I think are too strong. But if that's the ask and we end up getting a commitment to begin an immediate revision for active transportation safety, I think that would be a pretty good thing given the history and where it's come from. There are some online webinars. The Association of Bicycle and Pedestrian Professionals had one with Peter Kuntz, a traffic engineer out of the Portland area, who's great. It can help you learn about it. Federal Highway Administration had a webinar specifically on bike ped elements a couple weeks ago. It filled up really fast, but they have posted that. And then an example of the letters that are submitted for this was profiled in a Streetsblog article from Chicago DOT on what they saw as changes that were needed, to give you an example that's there. So the real gory details, NPA, Notice of Proposed Amendment, that's in that original kind of letter that was sent out by that NCU TCD member. Here's the link to go to issue comments. And I've kind of tried to walk you through this. Cynthia's going to send out these links. Here you can go to browse and comment on documents. When you do that, you will see this, but down there about halfway, you'll see the proposed text of MUTCD, or what I showed you, the red line version, the corrected proposed text. If you open that or download the PDF, simply do a word find, a Control F, and you can type in pedestrian, bicyclist, things like that, and it will kind of get you through to where those references are. You don't have to look in there for design standards for an elk crossing sign or something like that, but it's a pretty searchable document if you're interested in diving into those details. And you can look at the clean version or the markup that's there. I was going to show you here. You can see in the bottom left here, comments received 1,395. You can go in there and read all of the comments that have been submitted by different individuals and agencies. So there's been nearly 1,400. If you go back to the ones submitted in January, February, there was a lot of organizations asking for extensions to this. But this is the official portal by which you can submit your own letter. If you're on a local city's bike and pedestrian task force or have a city council interested in expressing some thoughts on this, those are all valid input measures for this. And it's probably pretty interesting to search those comments and maybe see what other agencies and organizations are saying in there. So I believe Cynthia is going to send out some of these links, and I'll help her put them together. If you want to dive into the details, you've got a little over a month to submit those comments, and we'll kind of see what happens.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Don, and thank you, Angie. That was a great presentation. I'm sure that there's some questions, but before we take questions, I do want to reiterate that because we have everybody's email, because you had to get the link, we will put together some of this information and send it out to all of you. And also this presentation is being recorded, and it will go onto our Idaho Walk Bike Alliance YouTube page. So please share it with others. And Angie was right, it is depressing. I've seen many of Don's pictures many times, and I still get really bummed out. So with that, I want to open up to questions or comments from all of you.
Cynthia?
Yes.
Hi, Elaine Clegg, Angie. Great presentation. Hey, I just wanted to offer a comment. I know a lot of the advocacy organizations are involved in this review, and I'm really glad to see it. Just as a point of information, the National League of Cities is also involved in this review, and they also have some very similar concerns. And so any of you from around the state who might be working with a city or a county, I think Don's suggestion to have letters from those cities and counties is a really good one, because that will back up whatever the National League of Cities and the National Association of Counties ends up sending in.
Great comment. Thank you, Elaine. I think that is really important that jurisdictions are commenting on this, because it does really impact the livability of these cities, no matter how small they are. Some of those pictures that Don showed are really tiny towns in Idaho. And so go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, one of the problems with it that I've heard groups like NACDO raise is that it doesn't allow localities enough flexibility. They really need to have some degree of say over what their places look like and how they function, especially their important commercial streets. So, I mean, while uniformity of signs, I think we all agree is important, we don't want to have a manual that prevents localities from making needed and wanted safety improvements. And that's sometimes the case right now.
An example of that is the 85th percentile rule. So many trainings and stuff here in Idaho act as if that's the only way to set speed limits, despite there being other endorsed methods from Federal Highway Administration, and despite it only being guidance in MUTCD, but it's treated as a strict shall. And we know enough today to know that we don't have to do that, but our smaller towns and cities look up to our larger organizations and agencies because they just don't have the expertise on this. And if that's all they hear, then that's all they know to apply out there. And that's where I think, getting back to Angie's comments, the flexibility that is in there isn't even cast down from, and that's not just to Idaho. I dealt with this in North Carolina and Alaska and other states where towns are looking to do better, but feel they're always hitting a barrier because of, they just don't feel that there's any flexibility in basic things like speed limit setting.
And another thing is, I think it like some of the larger cities on the coast, like New York and Seattle, that have very large budgets, have a lot of employees in their agencies. It's easier for them to take on something that's considered an experiment, right? But for like I live in Cleveland. And we're a very low income city. We don't have a lot of people on our transportation engineering staff. They don't have a lot of time to experiment and jump through extra hoops. So it really hurts, the smaller cities and their ability to do some things with their streets that make them more livable.
Great points. Thank you both. I'm just wondering, I want to ask a question about the 85th percentile. I can't help myself. Is there, because we get a ton of pushback here that 85th percentile is the way you set speed limits no matter what the street is. And is there another tool that we could suggest?
Yeah, the US limits tool from FHWA, and it's an online one that you can go and kind of, if you know certain road parameters, and US limits allows setting the speed limit at 50th percentile when there's a goal or for a pedestrian activity or documentation of that. FHWA, I think it's about 8 years old now, has a full guidance document on setting speed limits where 85th percentile is one measure, US limits 2 is another, and there's a whole other safe systems one that's a little bit more nuanced in there. So yeah, I wish we could get a training in the state on something like that so we could understand those types of things. And that's not saying everything should be that way, but we do have the flexibility, and a lot of it comes back to kind of going back to those tort claims. If we document why we did something, that's really the standard that courts are looking for. Just simply following a standard doesn't mean something is safe. It means you've done your best to limit liability. But if you document why you've done something there, you're going to be found to be in the right because you're accounting for local conditions. And that's really what it says.
Thanks, Don. Any other questions, comments? Anybody want to give an example from your community where you feel as though this document reduced safety in your town, or you tried to do something and you were unable to, painting a crosswalk or something in front of a school to give it color, for example?
I don't quite fit that example, but my way of thinking about the warrants for crosswalks and signalized crosswalks is that we're counting the swimmers across a river to decide whether to build a bridge. I mean, we're just asking people to do the impossible and put their lives at risk so that a warrant can be met. It's just, I think that's one to to attack really vigorously.
Thanks, Molly. That's a great point.
Yeah, I've got a question. Yeah, so where do we need to be looking to tackle the things that are less, infrastructures, but are like not necessarily traffic control device, but like lane widths, street trees, on-street parking? Like, is there kind of a national standard document that we should be looking at and taking on, or is that more localized?
I would say the answer to that is yes and no. A lot of times the AASHTO Green Book, which is another 1,000-page document, gets referred to as a standard. The word shall does not appear anywhere in the 1,000 pages of that document. And when you look at lane widths in there, it says a range. A range for arterial lane widths is 10 to 12 feet. A range for collector road lane widths is 9 to 12. So it is up to our local cities, our local highway districts, and our state DOTs to adopt standards. But I think we've all been said, well, no, we follow AASHTO standards, and it gets acted like it can't be deviated from, when it actually is a very local decision that obviously takes input and lobbying and advocacy to get to change. But we shouldn't allow agencies to hide behind this cloak of a federal standard for something like that, because it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, one thing.
Level of service, it's 100% guidance. There's no federal mandate to require an intersection or a road to meet a vehicle level of service standard, because there is no standard. The traffic the traffic software that organizations and consultants use also has pedestrian, bicyclist, and transit level of service tabs in it. But you'd be hard pressed to even find traffic study requirements or a corridor study in our state and elsewhere that use that part of the software. It's acted as if motorist level of service is the only measure, and it's not. Sorry, Angie.
That's okay. It's not really, I guess, an answer to that specific question, which, yeah, there's this other book too called the Green Book, and we haven't even talked about that. So MUTCD is only the signs and signals. But one thing that I think is disappointing about this is we're advocating that this manual not keep encouraging dangerous designs, right? It's encouraging things that are dangerous. It's mandating things that are dangerous. And I wish we were to the point with our manuals where they were discouraging or forbidding things that are dangerous. Like Don shows those pictures, where there's a crossing where people have to cross 6 or 7 lanes. I think in a lot of cases there should be a requirement there that there be a pedestrian refuge island on a crossing that long or something like that. So we sort of have a long way to go with all this.